Yeah, one of these times I'm going to hit record and it's not going to start, and then we'll be.
We're just gonna have a whole conversation.
Or
uh,
you're going to record the wrong thing.
yeah, yeah.
Forget
what's
that it's recording.
what's hard about this current week that everyone's teaching on, and then this week, Isaiah 58 through 66, you have general conference right in between the two, right? So in the middle of that, those great messianic chapters, you got living prophets, right? And then before you can jump into some of this good stuff, they just spoke to you. I mean, how much time do you guys give to general conference before when you get back? Like how much time do you give in your classes? And how do you
I've usually taken a day.
Yeah.
solid day?
I try to do a solid day where we try to outline themes, like repeated themes. We talk about favorites, what were the favorite messages. And then we try to put we try to go back and explore the invitations that were given and talk about the ways we can but yeah, solid day on that.
Sometimes we'll build in a seminary conference right around general conference time, maybe a little after general conference time, so that the kids, and it'll be a whole meeting, right, where it's a little bit more formal. You ask kids to speak and give a talk, and there's musical numbers. And sometimes it doesn't work in the schedule, but if you can make that work, that for me, that has been some of my most spiritual days in seminary, because the students are the ones leading out. You have a student conducting, you have maybe some expected people giving talks, but maybe some unexpected people giving talks or testimonies. And then a lot of our kids have these musical talents that will bring the spirit. And so it's another way to make that general conference time, to extend that out a little bit. So it's not just in one ear and out the other. And then it kind of makes that time a little bit of a special time.
Yeah, and maybe we're giving this pointer a little bit too close to conference, but you can do it after conference as well. This works really good, especially if you're teaching in a building with other teachers. I have several of those programs where there's between two or teachers teaching. You combine those and you have a conference day together, and it can work. It can work. I've been in some that don't work very well, so you have to know your students pretty good to give that a go. So we always focused on invitations. That was always a really great. Let's talk about the things that prophets have asked us to do, and we discuss why they asked the invitation, why they made the invitation, and then we go through some ideas on how to keep and do some of those things. So.
And if there are any big announcements too, sometimes it doesn't really hit the youth what's being announced and why they're big. I remember when the Melchizedek priesthood was reorganized at the ward level, we took a little bit of time to understand what was going on there, and it's just a good time to make sure they caught what the prophets are doing, and as the prophets are announcing priorities, reorganizing things, getting us ready to move forward, it's a good time to help them be aware of it.
Yeah, and let's be honest, not every kid's going to watch conference. So if you can give them some things that will cause them to go to, and make some invitations for them to watch a speaker that was impactful, that's always helpful. That's a good way to support the family. So. All right, with that in mind, so that's the challenge. You got a general conference that takes place before this week. And then in chapter 58, you have two doctrinal mastery verses, which
I think tie into, if you did it right, you could tie those into to a general conference review as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, those are going to come up.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about the process. Like, one of the things that is important to remember is that no topics are given for general conference. They use fasting and prayer to determine what the Lord would have them say. And so, right there, why do we fast? What are the blessings of a fast? Like, he's going to make his will known if we allow him to speak to us. It's a time of contemplation, and this is a process that's used for trying to understand and know the will of the Lord.
Yeah, I think there's definitely ways that you can kind of use Isaiah to help us understand. There's lots of last day gathering stuff, and you're going to hear that a lot in conference. You're going to hear a lot of gathering. There's constantly messages on the second coming and preparing for his coming. Those are literally those two topics. That's 59 through 66 are those things with messianic prophecies kind of sprinkled throughout. So yeah, if you can mix them, that's the way you're going to do it. Otherwise, you may spend a good week conference, fasting, Sabbath, and whatever else you can fit. That almost fills up your week, right? So from these chapters, what stands out to you as you're looking at them in mind as a teacher teaching youth? What were some thoughts that kind of came to your mind as you went through these?
One thing for me, as I was going through these in preparation for our discussion, we have to be careful of proof texting, of going into a text and being like, oh, see, that's what I was looking for. Oh, see, that's what I was looking for. We want to read the text as the author intended as much as possible. But time and time again, I just saw confirmations that the restoration and the teachings of the prophets during the restoration, and even the way, something like the way we do fast offerings, that they're right in line with what Isaiah and the Lord are teaching here. You look at where Isaiah is trying to direct people's attention in the fast. He's trying to direct it. What's a true fast? A true fast is caring for other people. That's right in line with what we do with fast offerings. When we look at some of the themes of gathering that come up here, like in chapter 60, it happens a little later on as well. There's this theme of, we have the covenant, like the ethnic Israel and the Gentiles coming together in one covenant. And the way that the Book of Mormon brings out those interactions, that's something our students know about the world. They know that the world is divided, and they know that people are building walls in between different communities. And from the beginning of the restoration, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, this idea of Gentiles and ethnic Israel working together to establish one covenant community has been so central, and it's so clear in these chapters here. And then it gets lost somehow in a lot of Christianity, a lot of discussion about the Old Testament. And so I just saw
and Paul tries to reestablish that, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what he's doing. He's going out and getting the Gentiles involved in the covenant.
So here, let me interject for a second. In our last video, there was a comment made. I'm going to see if I can find the exact comment. You're mentioning ethnic Israel, and you're mentioning Gentiles. I can't pull it up. Basically, the kind of gist of the question was, wait, I thought we were Israel, but now we're talking about that we're Gentiles, and so the confusion is in the titles. So who wants to give a whack of how Isaiah would describe Israel versus Gentile, and what are the different kind of nuances on how we should take that? Okay, so
Mason's got this one. Go, Mason.
Yeah. So I don't actually. So one of the words that the Isaiah uses for the Gentiles is the nations. Everything other than Judah and Israel, and at this point, Israel's been scattered. The northern kingdom's been scattered, so they're the lost tribes. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they are, and the way that the scattering happened was, it wasn't just, I'm going to remove you from this land and put you somewhere else. It's, I'm going to remove your culture. I'm going to remove your language. You're going to forget who you are. So if we're going to go through and kind of mark, okay, you're ethnic, you're covenant, that's a hard thing to do.
Well, I think we've done kind of a little bit of a disservice to the whole idea. You don't hear it much now. And in fact, the comment specifically, now I remember, they're like, I thought we were adopted. That term adopted is something that you probably heard a generation ago, but you don't hear that much now. And it kind of confused and muddied some of that.
Yeah, here's my approach to it. I think the Book of Mormon is very clear at who it's referring to as Gentiles. And I don't think it's a commentary on our DNA or anything like that. But when Nephi is talking about Gentiles, when he talks about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, when Jesus does, the Book of Mormon is brought forth by a nation of Gentiles or by a group of Gentiles that then goes and gathers. So as I'm trying to think about interpreting Isaiah's prophecy, I think Nephi has a pretty good bearing on it, and that's how I'm going to think about it. When in Isaiah 49, when the Gentiles are the nursing fathers and mothers, I see that as the restoration because Nephi sees that as the restoration. So I'm a better reader of Nephi than I am of Isaiah, and I'm actually okay with that.
So
kind of using the Book of Mormon to help me guide it.
So it is okay to think, we are Gentiles in these prophecies. We as
depends on who we.
Right. Well, I mean, like
Hawaii, so that might not work.
the modern restored church, beginning with Joseph, that was the fulfillment of the Gentile nation coming and bringing forth these things, as Nephi says, right? The writings that come from his people. But at the same time, adoption or otherwise, that I always feel like people make that too weird of a thing. We become covenant Israel.
It's covenant Israel that matters.
Yeah, that's the bigger thing. Whether you are genetically or otherwise, you make the covenant. Ryan, what were you going to say? I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that. I mean, that's the point that Paul makes in Ephesians. The only way that God distinguishes his children are covenant or non-covenant. The Israel story in the Old Testament is a story of God's attempt to bless all of his children, and when all of his children reject him, he picks a family, and through the family, they will then be the mechanism of blessing all of the earth. And so, I think to read Isaiah, yes, it's very specifically Judah. You're the remaining, existing, identified remnant of the house of Israel. You're the one that's going to continue this covenant tradition through Jesus Christ. Everyone else has been lost. And if you're non-Judah or non-country of Israel, you're Gentile. So those of us who have accepted the covenant and have entered the covenant and even had patriarchal blessings identified our lineage to Israel, we're still considered Gentile because we don't live in Israel. And at least according to Isaiah's definition.
Yeah.
Here's why I think it's important, because when we liken the scriptures to ourselves, I think the most effective way is to find your character in the scriptures,
right? Not
change somebody else's character into your character, because this is how Nephi does it. He says, "We are the isles of the sea." That's us. So when Isaiah refers to the isles of the sea, he's talking about us. So we got to pay attention to that part. So if we can help our students in this story to say, okay, where's the restoration? Where's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in this story?
Yeah. So,
right?
For example, Isaiah 60, you start looking, starting in verse kind of 1 and 2 talks about, a light has come, but there's darkness covering the earth. And then in verse 3, the Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. And then it starts talking about all the things that the Gentiles and those kings are going to start doing to help build this modern Israel nation. And
verse 7, Gentiles are worshiping in the temple.
Right.
Verse 7, which is cool.
So we have this moment. You say we got to find ourselves in the story. In 48 and 49, we're talking about Gentiles, carrying them on their backs. And here again in chapter 60, we're worshiping in the temple, and we're there to kind of rebuild the walls and reestablish this nation. That's us.
And then take it one step further to verse 16. Thou shalt also suck the milk of the Gentiles. Thou shalt suck the breast of the kings. That's secondary to thou shalt know that I am the Lord, am thy Savior and thy Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob.
There could be a Book of Mormon connection there, because that's literally what the Book of Mormon says it's supposed to do, right? And so if you take that metaphor of nourishing, That's literally what the Book of Mormon is supposed to do, is nourish the Jew and the Gentile so that they know who Christ is. And so there's a really interesting connection there to the role of the Book of Mormon. I was in 2 Nephi 25 with a couple of my other classes this week. And I love how Nephi is like, listen, there was a spiritual gathering first, or a spiritual scattering first, when they hardened their hearts in verse 10. Then there was a physical scattering in verse 15, the Jews shall be scattered among all nations. And then in verse 16, there was a spiritual gathering, that all these things will happen until they are persuaded to believe in Christ, the Son of God, and the atonement, which is infinite. And then in verse 17, the Lord will set his hand the second time to restore his people from their lost and fallen state. And so Nephi is totally seeing Isaiah's, this is the commentary after the Isaiah chapters. They scattered themselves spiritually, then they got scattered physically until they spiritually gather, and then he will physically gather, which is really the rest of Isaiah 60 to 66.
So then what we do is we take, I liked in Isaiah 63, it's kind of the why should God want to do this? Like what are his purposes in doing this, and what do we learn about God? Verse 7, Isaiah 63:7, I will mention the loving kindness of the Lord and the praise of the Lord according to all the Lord has bestowed on us, and the great goodness towards the house of Israel, which he had bestowed on them according to his mercies and according to the multitude of his loving kindness. That word loving kindness should automatically be kind of jumping off the page to us, because that's the Hebrew word hesed. That's Isaiah telling us a little bit about a character trait of who God is. And let me just kind of make a plug for this month's Liahona. Last October, before General Conference, they do a leadership training. All of the 70 from around the world gather, and they're trained by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And it was in that meeting that President Nelson got up and taught the Abrahamic covenant, which he does all the time. Elder Anderson and Elder Bednar both made comments to the effect, I've heard President Nelson teach about the Abrahamic covenant for years, but this time it was different. This time there was something about it that was more significant. The First Presidency message, they don't really do those anymore, but in this month's Liahona, President Nelson has published that message to the church, and it's specifically on this word hesed. And I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs here. He said, once we make a covenant with God, we leave neutral ground forever. God will not abandon his relationship with those who have forged such a bond with him. In fact, all those who have made a covenant with God have access to a special kind of love and mercy. In the Hebrew language, that covenantal love is called hesed. Hesed has no adequate English equivalent. Translators of the King James version of the Bible have struggled with how to render hesed in English. They often choose loving kindness. This captures much, but not all of the meaning. Other translations were also rendered such as mercy and goodness. But hesed is a unique term describing a covenantal relationship in which both parties are bound to be loyal and faithful to each other. Celestial marriage is such a covenant relationship. A husband and a wife make a covenant with God and with each other to be loyal and faithful. Hesed is a special kind of love and mercy that God feels for and extends to those who have made covenant with him, and we reciprocate with hesed for him. And it's there at another point, he makes the statement that it's not only it's the next paragraph, because God has hesed for those who have covenanted with him, he will love them, he will continue to work with them and offer them opportunities to change. He will forgive them when they repent, and should they stray, he will help them find their way back to him. And this is where Isaiah is going to end all his writings with this idea of, why is it that we can trust God? It's because of this is part of his nature. Even though you've been scattered spiritually and then physically, his hesed is so eternal. His love is, Psalms uses that word 126 different times, that it endures forever. we can trust that he's going to give us every opportunity to find our way back when we've been scattered.
So here in the context of 63, then that loving kindness of the Lord that's mentioned in verse 7, how do you draw the connection between that message to the message of the first 6 verses prior to it, where they say, who is this that cometh from Edom, from the east, right, with dyed garments, I that speaketh in righteousness, mighty to save. Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, thy garments like him that treadeth in the wine fat? And then the Lord says, I have trodden the winepress alone, for the and of the people there was none with me, for I will tread them in mine anger and trample them in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. Which is typically why we see Christ wearing a red robe when we see second coming,
Yeah.
in the clouds. So connect those two. How do you read?
I just think we paper over the type of abuses that these people were experiencing in exile, right? Like what we're talking about genocide. We're talking about the destruction of loved ones. We're talking about rape. We're talking about just trauma on trauma on trauma. And look, just follow the history of the Jews. That's how the story is told, scattering to scattering to scattering. And in a world where everything seems unjust, to affirm God's justice, that at one point, and this is symbolically rendered, right? This is an apocalyptic image. This is not just a literal description of everything, but when you have been wounded and wounded and wounded, and it doesn't feel like anybody's paid attention, you trust in God's justice. I mean, God is a just God, and that's
all
part
you
of
have left.
Yeah, and you hold on to that faith, and I really, as I was reading that part, I said, I just made a note. What does a whole people have to experience? What kind of trauma does a whole people have to experience to long for this type of a return for God? And I think it's a moment of actually of empathy for, and I know a lot of people who have been wounded like that, who really hold on to this idea that there's going to be justice, whatever that looks like, right? Whatever that looks like in the future.
Yeah, I think sometimes we read some of these second coming apocalyptic renderings of events, and it does kind of throw us a little bit for a loop. The wicked burn his stubble when he shows up, and here he says their blood's going to sprinkle his garment like he's been in the wine press, and then the very next verse he's like, but my loving kindness.
But they're like, we don't talk about love this way, but love requires anger. If you love somebody and you see that person afflicted in a certain way, and
should be an emotional response,
you're going to be angry about it. Yeah. Right. And the Lord, that loving kindness, in the New Testament, the word for faith is pistis. It means faithfulness, right? This commitment, this loyalty. And so I think we see a similar idea here.
And I think you can see that even in 58. We're probably a little bit out of time here. We don't want to go too long. But even in 58, you can see his anger is turned towards his people, not just the enemy of his people. The idea of hypocrisy.
Injustice, yeah.
Yeah, that's happening here. And you can see Christ, he actually plays it out fuller if you go to like Matthew 23. And you'll see how he feels about the hypocritical nature of the rulers of his people. And that's during Christ's time. That's not even, pre Babylonian exile and conquest. So,
well, I think that's why we need to make sure that we're using the right word when we read loving kindness, because that's what gets misinterpreted, and we start thinking that God's love is unconditional, that he's not gonna fix justice to the mercy, that it's only mercy, that it needs to be covenantal loyalty or covenantal love, which means we're in this relationship. All we have to do is just go back to Isaiah 51, where he's talking about where's the bill of thy divorcement. Like, I'm not the one that divorced
the
us.
same imagery, right?
Yeah, I'm not the one that wanted the divorce. You guys left me. And as a result, what right do you have to expect the mercy part of my love? Because I'm also just. So that's why I think that covenantal loyalty is a better word than the loving kindness, because it does tell us that though there will be justice, the goodness, that relationship, the anger is supposed to drive us back to him. Right? The reason that Israel is or that Judah is taken into exile is to remind, I mean, the whole Book of Mormon is the same thing. Why are they afflicted with war? It's to bring them back into remembrance of that covenantal relationship.
Yeah. And for us, it's the sacramental covenant, right? It's that constant, we will remember him always.
Always remember. One last thing before we wrap.
Last word.
As Jesus announces his mission, his ministry, we have Isaiah 61. He quotes Isaiah 61. And already his audience knows what he's talking about. They get the reference, but he's saying, I'm the Messiah and I've come to set the slaves free. This is it's a reference to the year of Jubilee, where all debts are forgiven, all slaves are set free. But it's another moment to center us right on Christ, that you can imagine Jesus growing up reading Isaiah, right? And then coming across Isaiah 61 and the moment that he had in seeing himself right here in Isaiah 61.
Yeah, isn't it interesting though? Isn't it interesting in 58, he's talking about the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath day. Here he's talking about the year of Jubilee, or as he calls it, the acceptable year of the Lord. And it's almost like, he's like, you guys know how you got the Sabbath. That happens often. You know how we do this year. When the Messiah comes, that's what it's going to be like.
The new creation.
It's going to be Sabbath. It's going to be jubilation. It's going to be freedom.
And I think it goes back to our doctrinal mastery. One of the reasons we have the Sabbath is to practice every week what we're supposed to live like every day. Right? With our hearts turned toward the Lord, with our covenants front and center. So because when we're living with the Lord, it is Sabbath. Right? It's being in his rest.
And same could be said of the fast. It's a practice of living the way we should live our lives every day.
Always remembering him, in the poor.
Okay, that's good.
Groovy.